All right, everybody. Looks like we've got a whole bunch of people logging in here. Good morning, good day, or good afternoon, wherever you might be in the world here. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started then. So my name is Ian Davidson. I'm the Chief Business Development Officer here at Segra. And on behalf of our whole team, we wish to extend our thanks to you for joining us today. Just in case you're not familiar with Segra, we're an ag tech company based in Vancouver, Canada, and we specialize in the development of technologies related to cannabis plant tissue culture and molecular biology. Michael, you want to advance my slide for me, please? Okay, one more actually, please. Thank you. All right, so today's discussion represents the first event in what we're calling our Segra Growth Talk series. At Segra, we place a keen focus on advancing innovation related to cannabis science. And along our 5-year journey as a company, we've been very privileged to build a tremendous network, including many of the brilliant minds in the cannabis space. So these growth talks for us are really a way to kind of leverage our resources and begin a conversation here with the broader industry. So the focus on the series is essentially going to be to provide a platform to explore science-based discussions related to the cannabis plant. We have a number of additional growth talks in the planning process currently. So please stay tuned in the coming weeks for further announcements, including in late March, we'll be hosting a discussion on hop latent viroid. So watch for that one. We know that that's a very hot topic right now, and expect some really useful information and discussion there. Next slide, please. And if you haven't already, please sign up for our newsletter on our website so we can keep in touch. And yes, there will be a recording made available on our YouTube channel for this talk and for future Growth Talk events as well. Next slide, please, Michael. Okay, so moving on here. Today's panel represents part 1 of a 2-part series that we're calling the Past, Present, and Future of Cannabis Breeding. Part 2 will be in late April at a date yet to be determined, and we'll announce that here in the next few weeks. Lastly here, I'm really honored to have been able to personally select and invite these guys on the panel. I consider all of them to really be mentors and colleagues for me personally in my journey studying this plant. And I couldn't be more happy to sit back with the rest of you and absorb the knowledge these guys are going to share with us today. I'm going to turn this now over to my good friend, Michael Williamson, who's going to moderate the panel for us today. Michael himself is no slouch when it comes to cannabis. He's got a long track record ranging from founding one of the first licensed dispensaries in the state of Colorado to breeding some of the industry's top genetic lines, and also designing some of the most sophisticated cannabis grow operations in the world with his company, Catalyst BC. So Michael, I will turn it over to you.
All right, appreciate it. Thanks for hosting this event for all of us. We're all excited to be here. On the panel today, I'm super excited and honored to kind of moderate for Ryan Lee, co-founder of Chemovar Health, Rob Clarke, co-owner of BioAgronomics Group, Mark Lewis, president of Napro Research, and Mojave Richardson, also co-owner and founder of BioAgronomics Group. So to get started, guys, I wanted to kind of have you guys give a little bit of pedigree information. And one of the questions that we're looking to answer here is, when did you guys make your first way into the cannabis industry? And also at what point and why did you look into breeding after you got into cultivation? And we'll start with you, Ryan.
Well, it seems like forever ago. I got into the cannabis industry quite early. I guess kind of when I was in, I was a consumer in high school, and then when I got into university, I was, I had a keen interest in genetics and was already making seeds and crosses, and so it was really kind of a way to understand. I guess I'd put like a practical side to the theoretical stuff I was learning in university. So yeah, it just kind of came naturally after that, really. It was all about finding new things and just screening plants and learning about the plant.
Right, thank you. And Rob? Rob, I think you're on mute. We'll give Rob just a
Okay,
second.
you still got me there?
Yeah, we've got you now. Thanks for joining.
I guess my first real opportunity was after going to university in Indiana was to go to the Netherlands and work with David Watson and do the whole hortifarm experience. And really our breeding aim there was to try to develop varieties for medicinal use, and went on from there.
Yeah, what year was that, Rob?
Ooh, I moved there in 1987. So yeah, quite a while ago.
Yeah, when I was 3. All right, thank you. And Mark?
Yeah, I'm also I grew up in Indiana, and I think some of the fruits of Rob's labor trickled into our ecosystem. And it was really Dr. Dre's Chronic album that sent me into the cannabis industry in the early 90s. And I just happened to be really good at chemistry, and went on to get a chemical engineering degree and a PhD in chemistry, with all just like creating a really great skill set for this industry, especially when you're in Indiana. You go to 4-H, they teach you that seeds turn into plants, and the first time you buy a sack of cannabis that have seeds in it, you naturally make the connection. And then if you can create seed, you can always have cannabis, and you don't have to depend on the undependable. So
awesome. Well said. And Mojave?
Yeah, well, I guess I was kind of born into a cannabis community. I was born in Big Sur, California in 1969, and there was already a kind of a thriving cannabis culture there. And cannabis was kind of the connective tissue of our community. So I kind of grew up in the cannabis scene, but it wasn't until 1993 when I moved to the Netherlands that I really started to get into breeding and trying to develop varieties that kind of represented the cannabis that I remembered in my youth in California.
Wonderful. All right. For some of people who might not be as familiar with some of the basics, there seems to be a lot of confusion around the terms indica and sativa. And Rob, can you kind of highlight some of that for us here?
Well, the words began with the taxonomists of the classical age. Linnaeus coined at least popularized the binomial cannabis sativa, referring really to European hemp. That was what was in his purview at the time. And then later Lamarck, who had seen cannabis from India, which he named cannabis indica. So that's where we got the terms to begin with. Of course, they're used completely differently today. They've become part of branding and advertising and street understanding of the cannabis plant and the variety therein. Basically, sativa these days refers to more narrow leaflet drug varieties. Maybe their heritage would have been ultimately from India, and versus some newer introduction, the Afghan varieties and Pakistani varieties that have come to be called indica. In reality, it's a giant taxonomic snarl, and we won't go there. But to people today, it means a number of things. The main thing is the effect. It's all gone from using these names, taxonomic names, to representing what the herb does, and that's the way popular words come to be and be understood. It's in my mind not a productive way to look at things. You can talk something being indica predominant or sativa predominant, and that has something to do with its effect compared to the other one, but actually everything's a hybrid. It's all in between somehow. So it seems inadequate terminology, but that's what we got. So we'll run with it for now.
Yeah, it definitely seems like there's a lot of improvement for retail education and, people thinking that they need something based off of this classification, which, as you highlighted, is a lot of, polyhybrids. Rob, another question for you. What are the botanical basics that everyone should know about in the cannabis plant?
Well, everybody should know it's dioecious. That means that there's male flowers on one plant and female flowers on another plant, at least under normal conditions, the conditions the way it evolved. Monoecious plants are very rare. They've been used in breeding in fiber hemp varieties, now used for seed production also, for edible seed. But they're very rare. And plants that change sex are, well, we talk about that. You can induce this, and we'll talk about it shortly. That's another subject. But basically, they're dioecious. It takes a male and a female to make seeds. They're not self-pollinated in nature. So there's always that variable thrown in there, which will weigh on the next question. It's an annual plant. We've made it a perennial plant by cloning, but it's an annual. Normally, it goes through a seed cycle every year. And it grows as an escape in places, what people call wild plants often. And it does very well on the edges of human habitation, but it doesn't really thrive in nature. So that's, I guess that's a basic botany of it.
Wonderful. Any other complimentary comments there from the rest of the panel? Okay. Ryan, this one's a little bit more geared for you. How does cannabis breeding actually work? Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, well, I think, again, we'll come at it first from, you know, the kind of the perspective Rob was talking about. And I think it's always important to look at what an organism does in the wild, how it really naturally breeds. And then, you know, what we do to it is really a different thing. Because there's important consequences to learn about the species and the type of genetic variation that you're going to be working with from how it behaves in the wild. This condition where Rob's talking about what we have dioecious plants, males, separate males and females on different plants, really leads to a whole bunch of consequences in the breeding scheme. One of those, the main thing is that it makes cannabis an obligate outcrosser, which means you have to have two different individuals that come together to breed in the wild for there to be made seed, which will be the generation for next year. So really, I think it's a good way to think about it, for people to think about it, is cannabis is kind of more like a human mating system than it is, you know, like a tomato mating system, like a different type of selfing plant. And what I mean by that is the way that we breed, we're never really shedding genetic variation, because we're always passing on, you know, males always pass on genetics to the female egg, you know, kind of father to mother kind of thing. And those traits are then combined in the offspring. In other organisms, you get this thinning down of the population that happens as a result of the environment and the traits in the environment, and that leads to a narrowing of the genetic type. But as you can see with human genetic diversity, we have all these different genetic forms from all over the planet, and in the last 150 or so years, we're now bringing all these different genetic forms together through mating. And cannabis is much the same way. We end up with a lot of genetic variation and a lot of different possibilities, but inter-family breeding to make something uniform it becomes quite challenging as a result. So it's just important to understand that when we have the males that are producing pollen and it lands on the female plant, that's really the creation of a seed. But what the plant does from there on and how we shape it is really a consequence of human selection. I mean, Rob talks about this in Cannabis Evolution, one of his books. But really, the plant that we found when humanity started interacting with cannabis was a small camp-following plant, probably a few feet high, and it made a few small flowers with a little bit of oil and maybe a little bit of cannabinoids. And all the changes that we see in modern cannabis have really been created or reinforced through the eyes of man working with the genetic possibilities within the plant. So maybe that was a bit of a rambling explanation.
No.
There we are.
Perfect.
Beautiful.
It's very similar to corn, right, Ryan? I mean, corn, when they first found it as maize, it didn't produce a whole lot of the kernel. But then after 150 years of focusing on that kernel, now it produces biomass of cornstarch or corn syrup, the sugar form, and other lecithins that is mind-boggling, because it's 30% of the biomass, which is very similar to cannabinoids in the way that humans have stuck their hands into that machinery somehow just by selective breeding, and created a plant that produces 30% of a medical analyte. It's incredible.
Yeah, it really is. And I think people don't really understand the wild relative of corn was about the size, the cobs were about the size of your baby finger or smaller, maybe. They had a few kernels per cob, and now we have these massive cobs that produce, hundreds or even 1,000 kernels per, well, maybe 1,000 is excessive, but we have many, many kernels, much bigger cobs. And that was really done through rudimentary breeding, not using science. I mean, even the indigenous Mexican human population, they created, what we call maize, which is kind of what we call proto corn, right? It's a step before that's not quite as big and indestructible as the corn that we have now. But it shows that even with simple breeding systems, what humans can do just by looking at a plant and saving the seeds from the plants that are naturally breeding in the environment, right? And I think a good way to look at this talk is kind of to consider what the technologies that we're going to be using, or we have used in the past, and the technologies that we'll be using in the future, and how we can use those to shape and refine cannabis.
And the 30% THCA plant, I mean, that was bred by breeders in their bedrooms or their closets or their backyards, not really using science. I mean, they were just using their head state, right? And pretty much selectively bred other cannabinoids out of the plant's biosynthetic pathways.
Yeah, let's talk about some of those early breeders. Rob, can you highlight kind of what the early years look like for plant breeding?
Yeah, for sure. The early years were basically people just crossing land races, which means they bought a lid and it had seeds, because almost all weed had seeds back in the day. Yeah, there were sinsemilla shipments that led to people understanding the meaning of the word as seedless, but weed had seeds, and people were curious, and as primates that we are, and we stuck them in the ground in gardens. And a lot of the early growers were people who already had gardens, vegetable gardens, places where it was natural for them to go, stick them in the ground, and farmers as well. But it's really started as a garden crop, and it's spread from there. But the early days where you got a bag of Mexican and you grew that the first year, and then you got a bag of Colombian sometime in the interim before the next spring, and then you planted some of those, and lo and behold, that sex thing came in again, and seeds were there, and you planted those, and you had the first hybrid. And then the next year, somebody got some tie stick, and then you throw that in there, and that became the male, because you already had your stuff you knew. So then the next thing you have is half tie and a quarter Colombian and a quarter Mexican, and that goes on and on. So we began with polyhybrids. It went from land races to human curiosity and basic breeding, like we've been talking about, take over. And that's what happened. Those are really the early days. What happened a bit later, and it goes back to what Mark was just saying, it's what went on when Prohibition suppressed cannabis so much was that everybody hid out. Then the internet came along. And I think the cannabis breeding is one of the earliest and most poignant examples of crowdsourcing. And this is the other end, not really early breeding. Sorry, I kind of jumped, but they're tied together there. And yeah, it's the future. We'll see what holds, but so far it's been a fantastic ride. That's for sure.
Yeah, Mojave, I'm interested in some of the kind of input you have, being pretty much born into, a mecca for cannabis, but what were some of the early pioneer breeders working with, and how did their breeding objectives also evolve over time?
Well, as Rob mentioned, the early breeders, in my experience, were all growing with landrace varieties. And their objective was more to perpetuate what they had already found. I think I think most of the work was done before the imported cannabis reached these modern breeders. That they developed and they crossed, but most of the work was done. I think some of the early import cannabis was phenomenal, and it was already kind of developed, and it was more about acclimating it to the region and growing it. They're producing a fresher and more healthier version of these plants. And I think it's something to recognize, is that out of these early landrace based hybrids, because once it leaves the land, it's no longer a landrace, that there was a little development done, and then the product of that breeding was then passed on to the Netherlands, for instance, and then they were utilized for stock material to make seeds. But the bulk of the work was done, before they made it to the Netherlands. And they were, some breeders definitely did a lot of work and increased the potency and increased the various agronomic traits. But if you think of Afghan 1 and Hindu Kush and Durban, these are bag seed that came from imported cannabis and then was worked on a little bit and then was used to make seeds for decades. So there wasn't a lot of improvement on those original landrace varieties for quite some time. And some of them are still just a few generations away from their original source material.
Okay.
Yeah, we can't leave out the importance of the hunt. The importance of the role of the hunt played in this whole thing. I mean, we tend to focus as cannabis consumers or even breeders as on the wins, but I mean, there was thousands of people trying to grow weed from the seeds that were in their stash, like Rob was saying, and there were a lot of that were failures, right? I mean, there's a lot of plants, especially that come out of these landrace populations, that really aren't very good. We call them dogs. They're just plants that are way subpar. And so you have to grow through a lot of those terrible plants to really find the ones that are exceeding for drug content. And often what we were doing, like Mark said, was we were using our brains kind of like a little bit like a GC and selecting for the compounds of the plants that had the highest THC content. And that was really based on how it made us feel, this kind of idea of a bioassay, right? It's that the experience that we get from consuming the plant really dictates our choices in selecting the plants, right?
And of course, how it smells and tastes. And it's like you cannot talk about how important bag seed was and has been since day one. I mean, that was like the treasure trove. And when we used to find seeds, it was like, finding that, toy at the bottom of the Cracker Jack box. It was like, awesome, we get to grow one. Like, you know what I mean? It's like awesome.
Yeah, and also just to think that the difference between bag seed from a clone versus bag seed from a pound of weed that was homogenized from a big batch of seeds. Most of the cannabis grown in the US was from seed, and when it would be distributed, there was not, every single flower was different from the next. So you couldn't just dip into the bag and pull out seed. You had to go and sort through all the different flowers and then make your selection, which was really hard. And as time went on into the late 80s, I started to notice that there was definitely more consistency among the batches. But in the beginning, it was, sometimes it was a dog's breakfast of different phenotypes all sold as one variety. So it was, it was a challenge.
And that was a blessing growing up in Indiana, was that IU University had one of the 2 DEA permits, and I'm sure Rob can speak to this, but David Watson had sent over, I think it was 157 seed accessions for them to grow out at the greenhouse there and do chemotaxonomic analysis on it. And as you know, I mean, college kids growing weed, those clones and seeds got out, and like Indiana just happened to be one of these little tiny epicenters that had kind bud, you know, it was like very serendipitous.
On that note too, speaking of the 80s and 90s, Mojave, how did the isolated and clandestine nature of modern cannabis breeders both hinder and help the development of modern cultivars?
Ooh, that's a big one. Well, for one, what you started to see is the impact of law enforcement on cannabis in the late 70s into the 80s. And that became the biggest selective pressure for breeders, was developing varieties that could evade law enforcement, whether it was a lower stature plant grown outdoors that could be hid under canopy, under other plants, or just harvested early enough that law enforcement, CAMP, California, their marijuana eradication program, they had a timing when they would release the hounds, so to speak. And it was all based off of late flowering, narrow leaf, semi-equatorial varieties. And when we started introducing Afghani and making these earlier crosses, you could get things in before the helicopters started descending on your crop. Also, the hybridization between these Afghani and narrowleaf varieties allowed for plants to be grown indoors, because they weren't 15-foot tall trees. They were these squat little bushes that you could grow under lights. And then at that point, you saw people growing cannabis virtually everywhere, as opposed to just the most optimal climates. You could grow cannabis on the moon at that point. So that inspired a lot of people to get involved and have a hand in developing their own varieties where they normally wouldn't have that opportunity. And I think that did a lot for preservation of cannabis, that we now had these little incubators going on all over the world. But it also meant that the agronomic traits became maybe more important than the chemovar. So it was now the primary selection was for yield, for size, and for flowering period, where earlier cannabis was more all about the effect, and certain varieties that had amazing effects and positive attributes were no longer available because they just didn't make it indoors, or they just took too long to grow.
Yeah, we really can't understate the influence of Afghanica being introduced into the drug pool in like Rob, mid to late 70s, mid to late 80s, or sorry,
late 70s.
Yeah. Because they brought not only the genes that you're talking about for small stature plants and higher yield and higher resin content, but also some of the genes for, like the source of the hydroxylated terpenes comes from that Afghanica side too, right? So we wouldn't have had those things occurring in some of the more equatorial populations. So, we could talk about some of the bad traits that came in too, right? The lack of mold resistance that came along with that compact form. So it's really interesting how the plants that came into the United States predominantly, where they were being shipped from when it was Mexico or Thailand or Colombia in probably the late 60s and early 70s. And as these more diverse sources, people went around the world looking for different sources of cannabis to import. That's when the Afghanica plants kind of started flooding in, right? And that's had a major impact on the way that not only the cannabis community is developed, but also like how the plant was grown, but the types of user experiences that were available.
Hey, Mark, this next question is for you. And I don't know if you want to comment on this picture on the right that you've provided for us here on the screen as well. But what have been some of the major milestones in the history of cannabis breeding, in your opinion?
Obviously, David Watson's curation of land races, and he and DeMeyer's working to create single cannabinoid plants that were then, Ryan knows more about this than I do, but that was huge to learn the plasticity of the plants through DeMeyer's papers and Dave's work. But then obviously the removal of prohibition in certain states for medical uses opened the door for, for like Napro research, for example, to set up a laboratory and start using chemical markers to drive breeding, and then be able to tease apart the different traits. And then obviously now with the SNP chips coming out from Eurofins, and groups like Oregon CBD using that technology to really drive that single cannabinoid model. The timelines, it's pretty there. It's there. But I think the true innovative work was when, we started trying to create, some people get adverse effects from cannabis products, and to remove adverse effects from a product is always a good thing. To make a product safer and still provide you with the ability to get high or find pain relief or whatever it may be, without paranoia, anxiety, or different types of adverse effects. I mean, that's a true milestone in breeding, similarly to creating a plant that produces all CBGA in a bud format. But Ryan probably has a great perspective on this, because he kind of sits in the captain's chair of the whole cannabis breeding thing, even back into the 90s. And I think that picture at the bottom right there was Ryan's. That's his grow right now in British Columbia, I believe.
You're on mute, Ryan.
It's actually a picture of Mark's college closet. But we're talking about David Watson's work in the creation of the single cannabinoid varieties that ended up being licensed by GW Pharmaceuticals. I mean, there's no better person to talk about it than Rob. I mean, he was there and right in the middle of the whole thing. Can you tell us, Rob, about how that came about, the pursuit of the single cannabinoid varieties, and the idea that you could explore, David's wild collection for the plants that would become, the progenitors of what led to all the different cannabinoid chemistry on the market?
Wow, that got to be a big question. Back to the GW beginning of the question. One thing led to another. That was not the first intent. The first intent was to produce THC, natural version of dronabinol, the registered name for delta-9 THC, and the pharmaceutical name, and produce it naturally, because Marinol was based on synthetic dronabinol. Hence their easy approval as the pot pill. It was the answer to people who smoked cannabis saying that it was medicine. The government could say, okay, we have medicine. It's called Marinol. See, this little pill. It's got the active ingredient, same thing you guys like. Here it is. That's why it got fast-tracked, and that's why it ended up where it was. But it was an easy target for a generic equivalent. And that was originally what we were doing. The GW thing came along later, and that's where it all started, for a little history.
But GW came along because you guys found all these different plants that had different chemistries, right? I mean, they were looking to set up a pharmaceutical company, and you guys were the place that had the supply, right? One of the only places in the world that had this diverse chemical supply.
We did, and they basically were focused on one compound, and that was THC.
Okay.
CBD was included in the program basically because they wanted to ameliorate the naive user effect. That's when an old fart like me does it for the first time and their heart beats really fast and they go, I don't feel so good. And that happens in all their trials, even the ones that pass at about around 10%. I mean, probably can give anybody a sugar pill and is in the hospital, and 10% of them don't feel good, you know. But they were trying to ameliorate the effects, and through anecdotal evidence provided by David, basically, CBD was not, it kills your buzz, you know, and that's where it came from. And just that simple user knowledge led to them using it to ameliorate those effects. And that's where we ended up. And on from that, then CBD became a first line pharmaceutical, hence Epidiolex. All this is a good thing, but that's the history of how CBD ended up in the program.
Well, and to address your CBD kills your buzz, I would say that it attenuates your buzz, because if you have something that's 4-to-1 THC to CBD or 10-to-1 THC to CBD, it tends to have a much more indica effect, like knocking you like onto the couch hardcore, whereas THC alone has that more, like you said, heart pounding effect depending. So it's I'd say when you get 1-to-1 and less, it definitely kills your buzz.
Yeah, and that's something that we learned through the Napro breeding programs, was that we could achieve cannabinoid ratios that we didn't find in the natural population, right? And some of those strange or altered cannabinoid ratios, when you put them in a flavor profile that's pleasing, that the market is used to, you know, then you really have this new type of cannabinoid experience that just doesn't exist, or hadn't existed, I should say. But, you know, up until that point in time.
And think about how one-dimensional today's marketplace is with it's just THC. But the vast majority of users of cannabis or hemp products are really using an enhanced or type 2 product, because all of the hemp is getting sprayed with something and then getting bought and sold on the black market, going, you know, the other towards the east or whatever. It's really interesting to think that these people go into tobacco shops are essentially smoking an enhanced product, and they're one of the biggest growth user groups in the United States right now. And then when you mix in THCV, or for instance, there's cultivars that are out here that, you know, that are a type 2, which means they have THC and CBD, but they also have propel. So now you're talking about 4 cannabinoids in the mix. And if there's a, you know, 1+% CBG, that you got 5 cannabinoids in the mix, those cocktails really begin to create what was truly meant by the original entourage, dubbed by Meshulam, right? Like the cannabinoid entourage, let alone layering on top of that, like Ryan said, the OG nose or the Jack nose, which also layers on another pharmacological piece.
Yeah, it's funny that we, you know, these things exist, and I think that the market is, you know, they understands that these things can exist, that these, you know, these types of cultivars could potentially exist on the market, but their real market penetrance is, like you said, they're not really accepted. The people that go to the dispensaries looking for their cannabinoids, I mean, they're usually looking for THC. Right.
Fair enough. But, you know, with the right consumer education, again, you have specific, you know, as you know, certain combinations of cannabinoids work great on, you know, skin irritation, or, you know, I mean, Sativex, you know, is a medicine for a reason, and it's not THC. And when you get into a recreational market that's looking for functional products, I mean, consumers love Holy Crunch because they can use it in the morning, get high, drink some coffee, and it lasts for 3 hours. And then when they smoke their type 1 later in the day, they actually get high again. Whereas, you know, you smoke type 1 all day, all THC, you have a tendency to kind of taper on that getting high a little bit. It's like a refresher for your endocannabinoid system or something.
Yeah, that's well said.
Dr. 80 Ray is going to publish some. Dr. 80 Ray is about to publish some interesting data on that they've collected at the one of the Oregon festivals, cannabis consumption events, on the different preferences, chemistries. Because again, people are buying, you know, when they go into the store, they don't really, you're overwhelmed when you go into a dispensary of choice. and you don't really know how to differentiate between the different products, right? And so the natural thing that everybody goes to is, well, what's the highest THC? And I think I've said it before, but I think it's important to say again, up until even the early 2000s, that's not the way that cannabis was purchased. Nobody knew about, everybody assumed that higher THC was better, but nobody really knew. I mean, THC wasn't on the bottle, right? It wasn't on the label back then. So the way that you would select the cannabis that you'd want to buy is you'd put your nose into the bag and see what smelled and looked good, right? And it didn't really have anything to do with the number per se. It was more judged based on the user experience. And we've kind of moved into this market where people are now buying based on a number, on a metric, because that's kind of something that they have to grab onto. Anyway, I don't mean to divert our talk here, but
no,
okay.
It's just great that you mentioned some of those things, and the future is definitely a more robust cannabinoid offering and chemical offering, right?
Let's shift from the past to the present for the sake. You guys are, like most growers and breeders, very ambitious with all the information that you are trying to accomplish today. But yeah, if we can shift a little bit, this one's going to be for Ryan and for Mojave. Present day, what objectives drive the thinking of today's cannabis breeders? What type of desired traits are they looking to enhance or to alter?
Well, I'd say that, just to follow up on what we were just talking about, I mean, it's all about predicting what the consumer's needs are. We're in kind of this era where cannabis is now being marketed like other products with packaging and media, and it's about connecting the cultivar or a variety with the end user, right? Just like what Mark was saying. I think there's a cannabis variety for everybody. But predicting what that variety is going to be is the challenge, and finding the user that's seeking that particular effect is extremely challenging. But cannabis does so much for so many people that we all know that there is a variety for everybody. But as in terms of selecting cultivars and selecting and developing new varieties, you have to have foresight 12 months ahead of the market, and you have to be able to predict where the market is moving. So it always comes back to education. The consumer needs to be educated so that the supply chain can meet their needs. Right now, people love purple weed for whatever reason. I think purple's a pretty color and it sells well, and people are driven by these, associations with other products. We've got all these sweet cakes and cookies and stuff like that, which tap into our primal love of carbohydrates. So we got two competing fronts. One is the marketability of the product and how you reach your consumer, and the other is actually producing and developing varieties that address the needs of the consumer. And I think that those are challenging for breeders and challenging for cultivation groups in order to align those and be able to predict what the future cannabis varieties are going to be. So yeah, I talk with cultivation groups all the time who, build up their mother blocks based off of the trends of today. And by the time those blocks are all established and they're making clones and putting them into production, everything's changed. So it's a guessing game.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Changeover at commercial scale. A lot of people don't realize they try and stay with these trends. By the time they identify a trend, they're already midway in the trend. And by the time you get everything into population, it's a year later and it's over. So I can relate to that one personally. If you had to identify like a top 3 desired traits on a breeding project, maybe a recent one, is there something that rings out to you there?
For me, well, it's pest and pathogen resistance and the effect. I mean, effect has always been primary for me. I kind of feel like if I had to chew a bitter pill to get the effect the desired effect, I would do that way over, a strawberry flavored Vicodin or something like that, and I think that that's really hard to relay to a consumer when cannabis now is so dynamic and has such an amazing aromatic profile. but to me, it's all about effects, you know, and that's why I was drawn to cannabis. I think that's why people, you know, that's our primary concern. But now color and flavor seem to predominate, and as mentioned, for THC content, you know. So yeah, I've always felt that pest and, you know, resistance and effect are the two primary, you know, concerns.
And Ryan, do you want to piggyback on some of that?
Yeah, I think again, to look at what we've been doing is really, you know, Mojave calls it effect, but truly that is smell and cannabinoid content, really, or scent and cannabinoid, scent, flavor, and cannabinoid content. And that's kind of what we've been focusing on. I don't mean we, but I don't mean we personally, but we as the cannabis community has been focusing on. We haven't had the ability to run proper breeding programs to be able to lock down things like resistance, right? Those things take time, and they take time to learn how to do. And that was really some of the early work we were doing at Napro, was trying to understand the inheritance of these flavor molecules or the scent compounds, so that we could learn how to shuffle the deck to get the desired outcome that we wanted. And you know, that was really within the last 10 years, you could say. So the way I look at the industry is we've got this incredible genetic resource, but you know, with corn and a lot of these other species, that all those crops were handed over to the plant nerds way at the beginning of the crop, right? I mean, those are the people that naturally gravitated to it. And cannabis really wasn't that way. Cannabis got harvested and sequestered in these disparate and remote gardens, like all over the world. And so different people were starting with different populations, and they were kind of all cobbling together their own car that they could just make it run. And now we're lucky to be, you know, 20 years into that cycle where we can start dipping into these different populations that people have been developing on their own. And we're able to bring these things back together in a more organized and structured way. And I think that when you're doing that, the only real way to do that is to start piece by piece, right? And so like I said, when we were doing that at Napro, we started figuring out how to shuffle the cannabinoid and the terpene synthase genes in such a way that we could stabilize and lock those traits down. And then the next step is going in and increasing, fixing properties like you're talking about, like resistances to mold or pest or pathogens, and improving yield and stature, and even a lot of these like basic plant architecture traits to do with morphology and structure for making a plant that's ideal to grow. I mean, those things kind of have to be added back in one at a time as you're building this. You know, a good analogy is like, you know, to build a plane while you're flying it. Like, really, that's what we're doing, because the cannabis industry doesn't have the type of crops that other industries like corn can rely on. I mean, if you want to be a huge corn producer, you go and sign a deal with Cargill or one of the big corn seed suppliers, and you plant their bulletproof corn crops, right? And you pay them a hefty percentage of the crop because they're providing you with a type of seed that is going to be, you know, allow you to build a really robust business model. And I think that we're only getting to that point in cannabis right now, you know, where we're starting to get to that point.
Ryan and Mark, I think you brought up a good point. And I encourage everyone to Google it if you haven't seen it, but they have these images of like every traditional commercial crop 100 years ago or 150 years ago and what it looks like today. And it's quite a bit different. So, you know, from my perspective, I think a lot of people are trying to, in their head at least, breed towards the utopian plant. And generally, you know, they're looking for obviously high yield, but they're looking for other characteristics as well. You know, one that I see people digging down on is like calyx to leaf ratio. You know, if you're in the business of growing for trim flower, you probably don't want to grow a cultivar that's 40%, you know, trim in a commercial setting. So it seems to be pretty common from my kind of out and abouts. But I see other people looking for like resistance to lodging. I know people are battling trellises on all kinds of different levels. So the idea of having, in my opinion, like a turgid plant that's, you know, self-erects itself and can handle a little bit of wind and jostle here and there versus, you know, 2 or 3 layers of trellis. would really speed up things from a labor perspective, particularly associated with harvesting, and maybe even increase things like better contact on sprays and things of this nature. Are there any other traits, Ryan, Mark, in the group here that you really think are kind of not brought into the light yet that are critical?
I don't know about, one of the traits that is critical for a lot of asexual propagators is the clonability of a variety or cultivar. If it takes root really easily, and when you take clones, you have this high frequency of stressed plants. So if you can reduce that population through breeding a plant that's easily asexually propagated, that works. We're seeing terpenes as a big focus, even for on the hemp side, and some of the breeding programs we oversee that cannabis-derived terpenes from hemp are proving to be a real market breaker for, people are doing well cultivating hemp for terpenes as long as it's not myrcene, because all hemp is pretty much myrcene. There's a couple lines now that are terpenoline, but there's 6 terpenes that can be dominant. And when you get into the limonene, the pionines, the osamines, and the linalool, then those essential oils really provide income for those hemp farmers who are struggling, who are growing for CBD or whatever. Then you have some plants we see exhibit, reduced branching or no branching at all, which could be useful in row crop, similar to corn. Instead of getting Christmas tree shaped, you just have straight spindles, and for fiber. But the resistance, obviously, those are big ones. The flavor is huge, and creating terpene profiles that didn't exist previously. Because when you looked at the cannabis market 7 years ago, you had like 5 terpene profiles, and that was kind of it. And with help from Ryan, we've been able to assemble terpene profiles that never exist. Things that were, pinene is a recessive terpene. Like anytime you hybridize it with anything, the pinene starts going away. You have to really focus on keeping certain terpenes to be codominant when you breed through them. So, for example, if you have something that's limonene, pinene, and beta-caryophyllene dominant, that really doesn't exist in the marketplace because caryophyllene and limonene kind of squash out the pinene. The only way to preserve some outlier in that case is to have a clone. Or if you have a seed producer who has a parental that's pinene dominant and a parental that is caryophyllene limonene dominant, and they homozygously breed those 2 terpenes to be those 3 terpenes to be codominant in the seed, then you have this new way of sharing homozygous seed crops based on flavor. So,
and Mark, can you elaborate a little bit on founder events and bottlenecking of gene pool?
I think that Ryan is the king of the bottleneck of the gene pool, because that used to be his sign off on his email was it the only crime against the cannabis genome is itself or seed? And I don't know. I can't remember.
I don't know. It doesn't sound like something I would say, but that founder events is all about consequences. And so, like, for example, a good one that people will understand is OG, right? OG is a great plant. It's got a great nose. I don't know if I would call it a great plant, but it's got a great nose and a flower profile. From a consumer point of view, there's a lot of things going for it. But it's kind of like you said, Michael, it's probably a plant that needs to be multiple trellised, and it takes a lot of support. So think of it this way: like when you choose a plant like OG, and everybody wants to have OG everything, OG cookies or OG whatever, everybody, like when it became popular, everybody crossed everything to OG. And so, yeah, you get that high THC, and you get that nice fuely kind of scent profile that gets added to whatever you're breeding with, but you also get to inherit all the bad traits that come along with it. And what happens is when the entire world focuses on OG, when Darwin said, survival of the fittest, what he meant was survival of the genes. The genes that will survive are the ones that are passed on in the most frequency. So when everybody's using OG to breed with, those genes become overrepresented in the population. Okay. And so all the good things that come from OG, yeah, they come into the pool, but you also inherit all the bad things. And when you only have a few individuals that are leading to the entire, like, I mean, think about it like, we're going to go to Mars and you're going to start a new colony on Mars. If you take 5 people, right, like those 5 people that that will have a big imprint on the future genetics from everyone that comes from them, you're overemphasizing the traits that those people have, right, in the forming population. And so it's kind of the idea that just understanding that when you go through a bottleneck means that, think of it like all the genes in a population are in a bottle, and when you turn the bottle upside down, there's the limit of the amount of genes that can actually get through that constriction is much lower, right? And so that has an impact on the future of the species from that point of view. And so it's really important to remember when you're doing things like everybody's breeding with OG that you're inheriting all the good characteristics, but you're also inheriting all the bad characteristics. And Rob writes about this in a book called Advances in Hemp Research, Paolo Rinaldi. And Rob wrote a great chapter about the plants and the cultivars that really founded the drug gene pool, mostly being, I don't know, Northern Lights, Afghani 1, Skunk 1, and Haze. And it wasn't only those plants, it was that a few, or those what we call varieties, it was a very few individuals from those genetic lines that were kind of what we say mated inter se, or crossed between amongst themselves. And the different combinations of those very few plants for a long time had a big impact on the drug population, the global drug population, because everybody was growing seeds from those crosses, right? So that's really what a founder event is.
Okay. Yeah.
And we have gone through, like I said, we've gone through that a couple of times in cannabis, once with the OGs and once at the beginning. And I think that we're always going through that. It's always nice when people come along like DJ Short or these gentlemen out of Colorado. I don't know if you know them, the Cannabis Potency Research, that have this freak show plant with the weird leaf shape. And, it's nice when someone pops up and they've been doing their own thing and crossing within their own genetic program for, say, 15, 20 years, because they kind of become isolated from all the trends that are going on in the day. And those are really great, what I call repair pools, or their genetic collections that we can go and draw from to kind of reinvigorate some of the interbreeding. Again, remembering that cannabis is an outcrosser. Inbreeding is very unnatural to cannabis. And so when we do these inbreeding events, we have to understand that there's genetic consequences to that. And they went through this with corn as well, so it's not to be unexpected.
Yeah, I like that terminology, repair pool. I'm going to say that one. I know one of the things that we talked about previously as a group was we're currently in a seed to clone market. And I think a lot of people had some strong opinions that we're probably going to be shifting at some point to a clone to seed market and move away from others altogether. So collectively within the panel, I'd love to have a discussion and get some perspective on your thoughts there.
Well, like Rob said, this is a seed crop. I mean, we don't grow corn. Not corn's a bad example, but very few things in agriculture do we grow from asexual propagate if it has a hardy seed. And when you compare the amount of horticultural required to produce from a clone versus producing from a seed, there's no comparison. When you grow from a clone, you have to first propagate it, which costs money, a couple bucks a clone. And then you have to skirt the plants when they get a certain age so that you focus the root to shoot ratio on the top so you get good bud formation. And they're usually susceptible to diseases and pests that have just come along, unless you have Segra's technology, which is tissue culture, which cleans all the plants so that they're really nice for production. But it's really a no-brainer when you compare a plant with a taproot versus a plant without a taproot. It's really remarkable. You can even grow in low light winter conditions with no heat and still get really great bud formation and good yields. Your pest and disease pressure goes way down. And like I said, the horticultural cost goes down. You just have to be working with someone who has developed seeds for the purpose of production instead of someone who takes a strawberry kush and crosses it with a banana kush and calls it strawberry banana kush. If they didn't look at the chemistry behind those two products or those two plants, and the resulting seed isn't going to be what they think it is, and all the panelists can kind of vouch for that. When you're just taking names and hybridizing hybrids, you don't really, it's the same thing over and over and over again, right? Like even when you look across all of the gelato, cookies, wedding cake, sunset sherbet, they're all beta caryophyllene dominant, a little bit of limonene and a little bit of other secondaries, and they basically have a very similar aromatic profile, and that's one of the main drivers of what seeds are produced. Like Ryan was talking about OG Kush. Well, OG Kush has fallen out of favor to the cookies family of hybrids, right? So I think in the future, as the hemp farmers have shifted to seed, that's a great model for the cannabis farmers to shift to seed. And pretty much anyone growing outdoors, whether it's Sonoma or Santa Rosa or Santa Barbara, they're all growing from seed for the BCC marketplace, because it doesn't make sense to pay what it costs to do the clonal work and put it in the ground, and then it'd be a crapshoot if you're going to have a fire or a windstorm or whatever.
We know that model's not completely dialed in yet, but if you had to predict a time where you see this transition being there at the level of like a Monsanto tomato seed as an example, what kind of timeline would you put on that?
Well, I mean, we have clients who have products that currently are homozygous, very stable, and perform in the field. But when you're talking about a complete catalog that's Roundup ready, Monsanto has to step into the game to get Roundup ready going for us. But I would say in the next 5 years, you'll see a lot more products entering the marketplace. I mean, there's a couple good autoflower seeds that are finally starting to get better on the nose out there. Molecular Farms has a couple great products that are autoflower and photoperiod dependent. Yeah, probably like 5 years and there'll be a lot.
And I'd say, I just added that I think that clones will always have a place. I mean, the closer we get to homozygous seeds, it's obviously, and it depends on the cultivator and where they're cultivating and what they're cultivating. But clones and tissue culture will have their place in the market, definitely for, maintaining breeding parent stock at the very least. And it all depends. I mean, some plants just are so unstable, like grapes and apples, that we have to grow from clone. And, some markets are so discerning about what they want that they're not ready to take the even limited variability that comes from seed crops. So I think that they'll still be relevant, but we all hope to be able to produce better seed. It's more reliable, especially for international markets. And
I agree with that, but I'd like to add that broadacre is the future for most of cannabis production. It's all cannabis, whether it's hemp or seed or drug, it's all cannabis. And that will weigh in a future question. But you need to think towards what agriculture really is. And it's broadacre agriculture. That's an Australian term, basically, but it means growing crops from seed on large acreage. And this is the way forward for producing cannabinoids as just cannabinoid stock, just like it is for producing seed or fiber. So really we need consistent seed varieties for that sort of production. They exist for fiber and for seed, but they don't exist for drug cannabis. And this is something that really needs to happen to really move the plant forward as a real crop plant.
Switching gears a little bit. Ryan, did you have a comment? I'm sorry, before I switch gears.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to say, I think that there's a little bit of a dichotomy. And I mean, like Mojave was saying, there are all these trends that happen. And cultivators have to be quick to adapt. But the truth is the seed process takes time. And so, to get homozygous seed of all these really variants, I mean, Napro is doing a great job of it, but I think that 5 years is probably pushing the envelope a little bit in terms of worldwide acceptance from most cultivation facilities. I think 10 to 15 years is probably a more realistic number of when people are going to start really planting the majority of cannabis drug crops from seed, at least those that are growing for flower. If you're growing for extract, it doesn't matter as much, but the flower market kind of really depends on these clonal productions.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that going to seed it would solve a lot of the problems like Mark was talking about. There are tons of advantages, but the truth is that those, we're, like I said, we're building this plane as we're flying it from parts that all these different growers have cobbled together over the last 20, 30 years. And it takes time to develop those plants that are, they're what I call bulletproof plants, right? Like the corn of today, where you can plant a field of 1,000 plants or more, 10,000 plants, and they all look the same. To make breeding parents that are stable, to get to that point where you can start creating those hybrids, it takes time.
Yeah, just kind of pushing on a little bit too, because I know Q&A is kind of a hot topic always on these webinars. As the market evolves, leading producers and brands are taking increasingly sophisticated approaches to curating cultivar menus, particularly in the new booming recreational markets. I've seen this time and time again where people will go spend 25, 50, $500 million and build out a facility. And then you talk to them about their genetic portfolio and what their plan is there. And it's kind of like this afterthought. It's, we're going to buy $5,000 or $10,000 worth of seeds and kind of hunt through some things. I guess, what should a producer's genetic portfolio management look like pre-operational and operational? And that's kind of open for all of you guys, but yeah, what makes up a ideal genetic portfolio for, a modern company today?
Well, I would start off by saying probably just Ryan's catalog, but that's a big statement. If you could pull up those 3 phytofacts, this is a great segue to to just show how you can have diversity within a dispensary or whatnot. And these are all products that are on the shelf in California. But the idea is that in the future, you'll be looking at phytofacts. These are report formats for different cultivars being grown in California and sold in the recreational marketplaces. And SC Labs now produces these for cultivators, so you can have a better standard of quality control, because you have your terpene profile that's color coded semi-intuitively. So if you notice on the left, you have the Happy Pineapple cultivar. That's it smells like pineapple. Like Pineapple Express never really smelled like pineapple. It was just the name. But this plant has 28+% cannabinoids. It has 20% THC with like 8% CBG, but the dominant terpene is ocimene and beta-caryophyllene with limonene and pinene, and it is really bright and pineapple-y. And then you go to the far right, which is a Space Force 1, it's 32% cannabinoids, 30% THC, limonene dominant, has a gassy back end, but a lemony front end. And then something in the middle that kind of smells like cookies is Holy Crunch, and it's 1-to-1 THC to CBD. And you have, a host of consumer tools on this report format that dispensaries and bud tenders can learn from and understand how to direct a new user, like Rob mentioned, or the OG who just wants the 30% THC, but also gives the consumer useful information about the product and how it's going to make them feel, how it's going to taste, how it's going to smell. And then once you begin creating a whole menu that is based off of terpene profile, because if you create a spectrum from, you know, the warm colored tones to the cool colored tones. On the phytofacts, you have red, orange, and yellow. Those are warm colors. And then the purples and blues are cool tones. The warm kind of, you know, tie into those sativa-like effects. The cool tones associate with the indica-like effects. And if you have a mixture of the colors, those are hybrid-like effects. And when we look at plants, we look at them from their morphology. So if you're looking at biotech seed catalog, you'll have indica, sativa, and hybrid for the structure of the plant, like Rob was talking, thin leaf, fat leaf, short and squatty, tall. And then you have the effects, the terpene entourage, indica, sativa, and hybrid. And that's what these phytofacts kind of do. And they're really great tools for breeding. So if you go to the next slide, please, Michael. This is a small shot of a seed population. And, you know, there's 4 different sets of bar charts. But as you can see, each individual cultivar is numbered 14, 21, 22, etc. And if you look at the second bar chart down with the orange and green bars, the orange is the absolute terpene concentration, and the green is the absolute cannabinoid concentration. And then the next bar chart under shows the relative terpene profiles. And then the bar chart under that shows minor molecules that most people don't even look at, but they definitely.
Oh, look, it's unlabeled.
and it truly affects the nose, and it's really neat. And this is an example of an F2. So we're trying to get diversity in the terpene profile. But if you look at number 19, it has like 4.5% terps and 20 some plus cannabinoids. So it's like one of the clear winners, you know, of this group. But
it takes you a little bit of time to look at these and actually understand what they're looking at. But really, if people focus in on the 2 middle rows of the kind of the rainbow row and the orange and the green one, the orange is, correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, but orange is cannabinoids and the green is terpenes.
You got exactly the opposite.
The opposite. Sorry. Or I do. But anyway, you can really easily look at a population and start to see, okay, you know, number 6, for example, is obviously low in both cannabinoids and terpenoids, but you can look at the ones with the high peaks and start seeing the ones that have the high levels of terpenoids and cannabinoids, and you can even look at the ratios between those compounds. So it's a really informative way to look at an entire population rather than looking at individual lab reports one at a time.
Right, the phytofacts make this possible, and you know, the guys that are growing the strawberry banana kush or breeding that product, they don't have access to tools like this, but we're planning on helping SC Labs make this a product of the future for cannabis breeders, so we can help move the industry forward a little bit more. I mean,
yeah, it's very cool.
These tools have been awesome in helping, you know, molecular farms and others create truly novel products in the marketplace that taste great, have a great experience, and it's truly tailored breeding when you break it down to the chemicals like this.
Yeah, and when you go back, and I mean, if you go back to the slide before where you're showing the happy pineapple, most people won't tell by looking at these lab reports, because you're kind of, you know, when they're new to you, it takes a little bit of time to read them. But once you've seen, you know, 1,000 of them, those plants that are up on the I don't know if you can go back to it, Michael, but those plants that were up on the previous slide, they're
technical difficulties.
Okay. They're pretty interesting plants. I mean, that happy pineapple is a pretty cool plant. 28% cannabinoids, 8% CBG, with that terpene profile, high in osamine, and it looked like there's a bunch of other little minors in there. Yeah, you got some limonene and some pinene and some beta caryophyllene. I mean, that's a cool plant. That's a
and that osamine came from bag seed of Hawaiian from 1994.
That's not from the pinchers line, then.
No. That's from this ended up getting crossed with a Blue Moonshine, and then Flow, and then back cross to the Hawaiian parent, and yeah,
DJ short stuff.
Yeah, nice. not the chemistry. It was more the early flower and the structure, because DJ stuff often was really early, like which I really liked. So
it's great to see this. You know, the phytofax is such a powerful tool, and for breeders and ultimately for consumers, which is really what we, kind of the underlining theme here is consumer education. And the fact that SC Labs is doing this with Napro, and that the Emerald Cup is now has a terpene class awards, which really, the cannabis awards really drives the market in a big way. And the fact that we're going to see people acknowledging these different terpene classes, and hopefully eventually the retail outlets also realizing that they need to have a representational variety for all these different terpene and minor cannabinoids. I
That's
think
great
really,
that they're finally doing that.
Yeah.
We suggested that back in 2014 or 2013, I think. But that's great that they're finally doing it. I mean, it's like I always use the example of a dog show, right? It's like you have what we do now is kind of like best in show, but they'd also say what the best Labrador, or the best poodle is, right? And so when you can actually start judging cannabis amongst samples that are similar to that type, I mean, that's quite interesting.
Yeah, like the IPA versus a porter versus a stout. I mean, it's the natural way, or a Merlot versus a Cabernet. And just so everybody knows, SC Labs did a great job on their website. If you guys want to check out the phytofax, they put together a video and all kinds of stuff. So
I think it's just also interesting how, the Cultivation Classic Awards out of Oregon, their terpene class excludes myrcene. They just say, it's not allowed.
Nice.
Yeah, they're just like, we're not even going to try it, because otherwise, the market is dominated with myrcene dominant varieties. We need to talk about other terpenes.
Hey, myrcene's not even on the GRAS list, so stay away from that stuff.
Really? I didn't know that. That's hilarious.
2018, they pulled it off the GRAS list. Yeah.
All right, guys. So I am going to push us forward a little bit here. Last question, and then we're going to get into Q&A. What concerns should producers have when planning for new genetics? And we had discussed educating end consumers through retail training and education. And also, how does geographic location and regulatory climate affect some of this?
Well,
it's huge. Regulation is huge.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's huge, especially in the international market. I mean, you look at all these new countries that are coming online. They're, they want to grow popular varieties, but they might not have the right climate for it. They might not have the right regulatory structure to allow it. It's huge.
I mean, I'm biased as a vendor, an international vendor of seed genetics and clone shipping around the world, but I really feel like in order to be successful, you have to partner with a group that knows what they're doing. Trying to do your whole genetic program on your own is crazy. If you're, like I said, if you're going to enter the tomato or the farm market, you're not going to, and you want to be a producer, you're not going to go and collect your own land raised seeds and start trying to put together a breeding program and make your own tomato, right? You're going to go to a known producer that has a reliable crop that you can rely on to support your business model, and you're going to make a contract with them. And in a lot of these companies, a lot of these markets, what they'll do is they'll allow a producer to have like a 2 or 3 week window where, the regulator kind of looks the other way, and whatever genetics end up in your facility, they end up your facility. But once that period is over, you're locked down, and you can only trade genetics or buy genetics from other people that operate within your system. And that creates challenges for producers that are always trying to create something new and stay relevant. Because, any given producer only has, a footprint of say 100x, right? And if you have to take 25x of that 100 and dedicate it to veg space, you now only have 3 or 75x of the rest of that space to use for production. Well, if you start taking away some of that space to do R&D to try and develop that new all the time, right? Like we're saying, a lot of these places might want to roll out a new cultivar every 2 or 3 months, right? So that they can stay relevant. And it's tough to do that all on your own while you're trying to run a business. And I think, in North America, especially, is becoming quite lucky as we envision full legalization in the States probably in the next 5 years with the new administration. And maybe that allows interstate commerce and potentially commerce within the North American bloc, where Canada and the United States can trade genetics. Canada is already able to do international business because we're fully legalized. So, Segra, for example, just released news that they, that we're shipping some genetics over to a company in Africa.
Yep.
And so the movement of genes is becoming more commonplace, but really having a genetic supplier that is going to be able to support a diverse menu, I think, is really critical.
Clean stock, I'd add into that. We've talked with groups, some in fully regulated countries that usually don't allow for immaculate conception. So all material has to come in with a phytosanitary certificate. And we've already heard, new emerging markets that have been completely infected and impacted by hop latent viroid, that they brought in seed stock, and it's already spread throughout their whole facility. So
it's happening in Canada too. I mean, we're not supposed to have cross border clone shipments, but it happens, right? And I've seen broad mites now in a couple of Canadian facilities. And for those of you that don't know, broad mites aren't really indigenous to Canada. So that's a result of people bringing up cuttings outside of the system and outside of the regulations, not only the Cannabis Act regulations, but we have regulations on the international regulations on the movement of plants. And what Mojave just mentioned, this whole concept of phytosanitary certification. And when people operate outside those regulations, there's consequences. So, be careful. It's important to be really careful of who your genetic suppliers are, because not only on the genetic, not only the genetic comes into your facility, also any bugs that are on that plant material come into your facility, and it can absolutely devastate your business.
Yeah.
Do you have the cannabis aphid up there, Ryan?
Not yet. I haven't seen it yet, but I'm sure it's on its way.
I've seen about every pest in Canada at this point. But so my takeaways there were: validate your partners or your resources. Clean stock program is critical, and divergent portfolio. And that'll give you enough building blocks for a good start to create whatever it is that's in your vision. Go ahead, Rob.
I said, well said. That's exactly right.
Okay. So this is where I have to leave you with a cliffhanger. As much as we want to talk about incredible things like marker-assisted selection, predictive breeding programs, pangenomes, and that's going to have to be for part 2. So at this point, we'll transition to Q&A. Thank you to all audience members that provided questions ahead of time. We were able to select a few, so we'll get started there, and then we can grab some out of the chat. Mojave, Ryan, Rob, Mark, if there's any questions in the chat that you find particularly interesting, go ahead and just, we'll pull them up after these next couple ones. So one of the first questions we had is, do you think hybrid seed will displace traditional clonal propagation systems? We've already covered that. We'll see. I think we're all excited for that when it's ready. The second one is a little bit more for part 2, but I thought it would be an interesting little teaser if anyone's got some experience. But has anyone on the panel performed double haploid breeding techniques to cannabis? You're on mute, Ryan.
We played with a bunch of that's a big thing. It's more than just spraying a plant with STS, right? It's a quite involved process, and we've played around with it a little bit, but we don't have any products. It's really R&D at this point in time. I would say that again is 10 years away from a reliable, workable system where we're starting to see people generate lines derived from dihaps.
Okay. Any other comments from the group here? No one wants to take that one. Okay. Speaking of STS or silver thiosulfate, does any of the panelists believe that using STS to self an individual plant will make the seeds be more likely to intersect? Is there a way to use selfing without creating intersect problems?
Does anybody else want to jump in?
I'll jump in first because it's going to need modification by my peers. But basically, if you start with a female, and I can't really describe to you exactly what a female is, but an XX female with no intersex tendencies, and then you use it to produce male pollen, then you're probably good to go. But a lot of the varieties we have are somehow sexually unstable. And I can't really explain that. Ryan knows more about that than I do. So.
There was a great paper just released by a group in Canada that they actually sprayed STS on a plant and looked at like kind of an induced gene response, looked at the genes that were altered in their expression. And there's like a whole list of, 120 potential candidates that also seem to make sense as genes for possible targets to be involved in intersexuality. People got to be able to separate male femaleness from intersexness. They're different traits, and they overlap in the way that we experience them and the way that we see them. But the truth is that they're separate traits. You can have male plants or female plants that are predisposed or not predisposed to intersexuality. And what happens is when we breed those plants together, when we self plants, which is really what we're most often doing when we use STS, all we're doing is increasing the frequency of those genes in the offspring. And so I would argue that it's not the STS itself that is causing intersex issues. It's that using STS allows us to execute breeding programs with tighter levels of inbreeding. And it's that inbreeding that is exposing these traits that are buried in the cannabis genome. Like I said earlier, cannabis being an obligate outcrosser, what that means is that plants accumulate genetic mutations. There's no drive to push those genetic mutations out of the population. And so when we do subsequently do things like use STS or create these tight inbreeding schemes, those rare genetic mutations are more likely to pop their head and show us expressions that we didn't know were already buried in the cannabis genome. And I think that's more likely the outcome, is that we're seeing these things occur rather than we're seeing these things occur as a result of the breeding system rather than creating these things, through our practices.
Well, and just from our experience across every chemotype and many latitudes and environments, the environment plays a huge role in stress-induced staminate flower production. So even if you do great breeding, there is this opportunity for a cold night or a photoperiod disruption or shitty root conditions that will create a staminate flower. And once that plant produces a staminate flower, it's hard to get that to stop expressing. So if you take a clone off of a plant that you've stressed, then you take a clone off of that plant and veg, and your whole clonal stock has this central, came from a single plant that was stressed one time. That stress could be enough to induce that staminate flower production every time you go into flower.
All right. Yeah. Go ahead, Rob.
Teasing that apart that's a hairball. What's genetic, what's epigenetic? But yeah, it definitely can happen. Again, one of the benefits of seed, right? It's like you'd hope a lot of those things were reset when you go to seed. But there are also epigenetic changes that are passed on from generations.
Right. The next question. Where do you think the cannabinoid and terpene conversation will be 5 years from now? Will THC and CBD still be dominant? And if so, where do we think their maximum potential for peak thresholds are? We've seen a lot of 30% THC cannabis in the last I don't know, 5 years or so. But you know, where is that limit?
I think we're right up against it. You know, 35% total cannabinoids is really pushing it. That's a really high number. We see it regularly, but it's a small percentage of the cultivars and things being bred. What's more interesting than just absolute cannabinoid or terpene content is how they are not correlated. So you can have something that has a whole lot of cannabinoid and not a whole lot of terpene, or a whole lot of terpene and not a whole lot of cannabinoid, or both, a whole lot of cannabinoid and a whole lot of terpene, or not very much of either. So the fact that they're not correlated is really cool, because it means that now that the cannabinoids, you know, are up to 35% and probably pretty maxed out based on the structure of the plant, unless we create some new plant that just basically grows a giant mushroom-shaped trichome that fills up with 80% THC, you can still drive the terpene content up. So you can add that flavor piece to those 30% THC products.
Yeah, I have a lot of, I mean, this comes up with chemists in the Canadian space often. A lot of people don't believe that those things aren't correlated. I think that you and I know that because, again, we've been looking at breeding populations. Most people get their data from the marketplace, and in the marketplace, they are correlated. But, you know, I agree with you in that there's something to be said. There's going to be something to be said, both in the extract category and in the flower market, for plants that are in the lower cannabinoid, or what we call the mid-tier cannabinoid content, you know, the teens, 10 to 20%, and, you know, higher levels of terpenes and terpenoids. Because that's going to, like you said, it's going to allow people to create a space where they're not getting whacked out on THC or overloaded with THC too early in the day, but are still able to access that flavor.
Yeah, I'd like to think that in the future, we're going to be looking at kind of the devil in the details, that some of these compounds, the relationship with each other are so critical that, you know, that very small infinitesimal amounts of various minor cannabinoids and terpenes are actually contributing a huge effect to the overall ensemble effect. You know, it's the second violin and the third oboe in there that really may be making the song what it is.
I had a question about, I guess, and it really kind of comes back to Holland. So I remember when I was going to Amsterdam as a young kid, I was considered kind of crazy for rolling up a pure joint. A lot of stuff was mixed. It also seemed like a lot of the general cannabinoid profiles, I don't want to say they were low, but they were kind of lower compared to common day. I'd say maybe with the exception of maybe some amnesia haze or something like that. But most of the stuff seemed to be kind of in that mid-level cannabinoid profile. Why was that? And when and where did it change, where we started seeing these really elevated spikes of what I'll call extreme THC?
Well, the cultural background in the Netherlands is that they were hashish smokers. And the way you smoked hashish discreetly and just, you know, without having a low volume pipe of some sort which is an American thing, North American thing. You rolled them in cigarettes, and a lot of people smoked, and the obvious no-brainer way to do it was to mix this sometimes not that flammable hashish into a tobacco and dilute it a bit and make it not so strong. But it also, the tobacco has its own physiological effects. I mean, it's people become highly accustomed to smoking with tobacco. And without it, they find it difficult to get high, even if somebody rolls a pure joint like you were trying to do, and it's the best thing you can find. But Dutchies would smoke it and really not get high until they rolled one of their own or just smoked a cigarette, and then suddenly they're bombed. So it was both cultural in that that's why they did it, and it also had a certain profound effect that North Americans generally haven't followed. Yeah, that's the history of it.
This is a question for each one of you. What was the cultivar that, in your opinion, kind of changed the landscape or had the most impact on the cannabis industry and breeding in general? I'll start with you, Mojave.
Well, the cultivar that had the most impact for me was Haze, just because that kind of rekindled my childhood love affair for that particular cannabinoid profile, terpene profile. But I'd say, and I think that everyone else might agree, that Skunk One definitely had a profound effect on cannabis, and that it was kind of a backbone variety for a lot of the Dutch seed companies and helped to kind of rein in a lot of other varieties like Haze, for instance, into a more workable line.
Yeah, I think that question for me is in what era? I mean, I would agree with you both, Haze and Skunk. It's pretty hard to miss the impact that Kush has had in the marketplace over the last 15, 20 years. Blueberry, there's so many. And I think that, to me, cannabis is kind of fashion. And these trends will come and go, and there'll always be people looking back to the past. Bell bottoms come around every 10 years or so. People start wearing them again. And I think that will be true with cannabis, but I see it as an evolution, and there's always going to be something new that's interesting. And that's part of the beauty of it, is really, to me, is not focus on whatever's the most highest selling thing of the day. Yeah, that's interesting for business reasons, but go out there and experience the diversity that the cannabis plant has to offer. There's a lot of great flavors and great effects that she has hidden within.
Bag seed.
Bag seed, right? Yeah, the same thing for us in the Midwest. It was, the Purple Kush was killer. The Super Skunk came through and it was killer. And then, when I first moved out to California in early 2000s, it was it was purple, and then it went to OG, and then it went to cookies, and it's just those all are all great plants. Mojave mentioned everybody likes purple except for the cultivators, because it takes like twice as long to grow.
It doesn't seem to yield.
Yeah, a lot of the perps lines take forever to veg into something meaningful, especially Kens or Granddaddy, or Purple Urkel even. Interesting.
Next question is, will breeders be able to breed cannabis varieties with extra long trichomes, several times larger than ones today?
Maybe that's possible. We always felt that the Northern Lights lineage looked sparklier than it was because it had such long trichome stalks. The heads weren't any larger than normal, and the density of trichomes on the calyxes wasn't bracts, better term. I apologize for that. But the density on the bracts was not any higher. But they look really sparkly because those extensions of the leaf surface that are the stalks, they also glisten. But I'm not sure why you'd want longer stalks. If you're a hashish maker, the largest proportion of trash you have in your dry sift is the bloody stalks. Even after you're sophisticated enough to get rid of the green leaf particles, you still have the stalks. So I would just like to have varieties where the heads fall off easy. Who cares how long the stalks are? That'd be
well. I think that was a question from David, actually. And I think.
Okay. Hi, David.
I think his idea is coming from, he wants to be able to pick them straight off the plant and peel it like a grape and just dip it in his dab rig, right?
Cool.
Yeah. Again, it comes down to, we do have some plants that are slightly larger sizes, and Marcus, Richardson, who's here, knows a lot about this from the amount of hash he's made. But I think probably it comes with, you know, if you get a bigger gland, you're going to have less of them per square millimeter, right? So, like we said, 35% cannabinoid content. If you include oil content in there, we're looking at upwards of like, or not, maybe not upwards, but we're approaching 5 or 40% by weight total of oil of cannabinoids and terpenoids in a plant. That's a lot of oil. That's a pretty oily plant. And so from overall from a chemical output, that's pretty good.
Oh yeah,
you know, I would.
as Mark was saying earlier, we're not going to push those firewalls much farther. I mean, there's no other plant, the opium poppy, any other plant that produces a drug at such proliferous amounts. It's absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
And a lot of botanists don't even believe it's possible. They think we're all high and all the research is weird. Sometimes I really wonder, you know, because that's an awful lot of secondary metabolite to get out of any plant. It's phenomenal.
Right. And having said that and thinking about the future of being able to hack the genome, and, you know, there's a common synthase and olivetolic acid synthase between cannabis and streptomyces. And we actually use streptomyces to produce, you know, bleomycin, which is an anti-cancer agent. So with the right type of funding, I mean, you know, and knowledge base, I mean, Seth's group is probably light years ahead on this kind of stuff, but like you could gene edit and very easily create different molecules for different reasons in a very efficient way.
All right.
Well, I know this is a never-ending conversation. It's been pretty incredible. The people in the audience are all pretty rock star as well, and it's been great to kind of moderate for you guys. We are at that point where we're going to wrap it up and leave you guys with kind of more to think about. This is one of many series, so we look forward to everyone attending. It will be recorded. It will be put up on, I think, YouTube and some other channels. So if you had to leave early, or if you want to re-watch some things and learn some stuff, again, that'll be available. And without further ado, I just want to thank everyone on the panel. First of all, I really appreciate the intel and insights that you all have after all the collective years of experience. And I want to thank Segra as well for hosting. And I will now turn things over to Ian Davidson to close this up.
All right, thanks everybody. Thanks for joining us. Thanks panelists. We've got a bunch more of these events coming, so stay tuned, please. And sorry if we couldn't get to your questions. We had a huge amount of them. And that's just great to see. So y'all have a great day, and we'll catch you next time for our next Growth Talk. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, peace and love.